All right, moving along, we're going to jump into Texas A&M and Miss State. And A&M had a bye week after a big win for them over Florida. A&M came into that game as an underdog. We both picked A&M to win the game. We thought it was going to be a little bigger than it was. We saw Mond kind of revert back to the freshman status on the road, but this one's at home. But they're also playing a Mississippi State game that just had a huge win last weekend, and we keep expecting Mississippi State to kind of go away, and they keep coming back, so that's great for them and Dan Mullen in that program. This is an interesting matchup, though, because both of them have strengths and weaknesses that each can exploit. So let's start off with Mississippi State, because we haven't talked a lot about them this year. We were real high on them early after the LSU win, and they kind of went away. And now that they're back, let's get reacquainted with this team. What did we see from Mississippi State last weekend, and what have we kind of seen from them since they had those frustrating losses against Georgia and Auburn?
Mississippi State's been able to play up and down to the quality of their opponents, I think. And to a certain degree, I think Mississippi State is a team that's a little bit bound by their talent level. And when I say that, they have a serviceable offensive line. I think they have some issues that presents itself from time to time. Fitzgerald is a very good rusher. He is a not great thrower. And they have a pretty good stable of running backs. When they play teams where they can get some of their players in space a little bit, and they can kind of make some stuff happen with the run game and get you off balance so that they can hit play action, be a little bit tricky, their offense works really well. When they've been in games where they can't establish a line of scrimmage against a stacked box, they haven't really been able to generate production. I just don't think they have the skill on the outside in the receiving core mainly to do it. And I also think it's just a little bit is just frankly Fitzgerald. And, maybe that seems to be a little bit, mean or rude, I guess, to say that Fitzgerald is a little bit lacking. But, he struggles to a really incredible degree throwing the ball in the pocket with accuracy and consistency. He just can't deliver it well. And we've talked about this a lot. Maybe this is a fun time to bring it up. ESPN's college football total QBR is meant to be this all-inclusive statistic for quarterbacks. It uses two main components. It uses something called passing estimated points allowed or estimated points added, and rush estimated points added. And then it takes that and puts it together and generates a total QBR, which is a combination of your ability to run and pass. Fitzgerald is a really high-ranked quarterback in that list. He's 8th nationally with 81.6 total QBR. And it's easy to look at that and say, well, Fitzgerald's clearly a very good quarterback, and this Josh guy that's talking on this podcast is insane. The problem with that is it really belies how bad his passing statistics are. He's an excellent rusher. In run EPA, Fitzgerald is second in the country, only by a slim margin behind Lamar Jackson. But in passing EPA, he doesn't even register. I mean, he's all the way down at 105th nationally at points added in the passing game. So he's not just struggling as a passer. He's behind guys like John O'Corn at 101st, Brandon Wimbush at 104th. I mean, it's just not great. He's the Navy quarterback's just a few guys back there. So when they can run the ball and they can use him just as a guy that hits the big open play action pass, he's good. If Fitzgerald has to operate a traditional passing game, he has really, really struggled this season. And Mississippi State has struggled along with him.
So one of the takeaways I had from the Kentucky game that I thought was really good for Mississippi State was they held Steven Johnson 117 yards, 4.2 average, and no touchdowns and 2 interceptions. Now, Steven Johnson isn't an all-world, probably not a future NFL quarterback, but we do see some things in him that we've liked for a couple of years now that show he's a pretty serviceable, capable quarterback. Florida had Fitz trying to stop the guy. He had some decent success running the ball against Mississippi State, but is this kind of a sign that we can take away from this, that Mississippi State can play some pretty good pass defense given the right parameters.
I think it's definitely a positive sign. I mean, Johnson had been a pretty effective quarterback going into this game. He averaged over 8 yards per attempt against Missouri in that win. 4.2 yards per attempt, to kind of give it context, that's his lowest mark since Vanderbilt and Alabama just in his first couple starts in 2016. So it was a really good performance from a guy that's averaging 7.5 yards per attempt, pretty respectable number. And as we said, had a 7.8 yard per attempt day against Florida. He's been pretty good. It was a good thing to see. And Mississippi State has struggled the past few years in pass defense. At times, quite frankly, they've struggled pretty badly. And so, a little spark of hope there from them. It's great. I mean, what lost them the Georgia game and the Auburn game, honestly, as much as they struggled running the ball, and you point to a lot of other things, they gave up 16 yards per attempt in those two games. And they didn't throw the ball a lot, Auburn or Georgia, but when they did, they were extremely successful. And they managed to throw the ball for over 200 yards in both games, despite throwing for 17 and 12 attempts. And it's just hard to win a football game when the other team can get huge chunks through the air whenever they want. So they do need to take steps forward, and it was really encouraging. Maybe Georgia and Auburn were a little bit of an aberration. Maybe it was a little bit trying to deal with other factors in the game. But if they can stop the pass against a guy that I don't see any reason why Mond is a better passer at this point in his career than Steven Johnson. That's not a shot on Mond, who's a true freshman. Johnson is a JUCO guy, and he's a pretty good quarterback. So I think it's a pretty good sign going into this football game for where Mississippi State was, again, because they were 100th or worse nationally in yard per attempt passing statistics coming out of last year. And just to have a couple of good games under their belt and get a little bit of confidence is a really big thing for that football team.
All right, and one more thing on this before we roll into Texas A&M, and I want to talk about something that our model doesn't capture, and we don't really get into this sort of thing with gut a lot, or human element or emotion, because we're a numbers-driven channel. But if you look at Mississippi State's season to date, they're 5-2 with 5 blowout wins and 2 blowout losses, and both of those losses were on the road. And you're going to tell me, yeah, they were on the road, but it was because of who they played. Is there anything there with the fact that those 2 games were on the road? And if there is, are you concerned that they're going to play at Texas A&M, coming off a win against Florida and coming off a really strong performance at home against Alabama?
Most of what I think in these games is usually just driven on neutral statistics, but there are times where certain things do matter. And one of the things that will matter is being a home and away crowd. And the biggest area where that tends to rear its ugly head is a quarterback that's struggling a little bit. The 2 games that they had blowout losses, Georgia and Auburn, were on the road, and they averaged about 3.5 yards per attempt in those games. And they threw the ball a lot. Threw it 33 times against Georgia, only got 103 yards on 33 attempts. Against Auburn, they threw 37 times for 157 yards. It was 35% completion percentage. I think a lot of it was the hostile environment. It puts a lot of pressure on Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald, as we were talking about before, I feel like I'm absolutely bashing the kid, and I don't want to. I'm going to take a step back here. I mean, he had a great game last week against Kentucky because he ran the ball up and down the field on him. He ran for 9.6 yards per carry against Kentucky. Same thing they did against Ole Miss last year. They destroyed him with his legs, and that's the guy he has to be. But he still averaged at 6 yards per attempt. He still was 18 of 26 passing against Kentucky. They've got to have some consistency passing the football. And I think sometimes because Fitzgerald just isn't very polished as a passer in hostile environments, he can really struggle. And when he really struggles, he misses a lot of easy throws that really cost them opportunities. It costs them third downs. And that kind of stuff really affects them. And then other teams start stacking up against the run, and everything kind of snowballed in those 2 games. So I do think the road environment is a factor. And honestly, there aren't many more road environments that are more hostile than College Station right now in that new stadium at Texas A&M.
And we're going to talk now. I want to talk about A&M, and we will get a little bit into the Florida game. And A&M fans, if you want to hear a little bit about how we saw the A&M Florida game, you can look at our Georgia Florida preview this week as well. We talked about it some, but I want to take a step back to a game before that against Alabama, because I think there are some parallels here. How much does it stick out to you that Texas A&M was able to hold Jalen Hurts to 4 yards per carry, and does that sort of carry over to defending Fitzgerald, or are the offenses so dissimilar that that doesn't really matter?
I thought it was a very good sign. In those two offenses are dissimilar in a lot of ways, but in some ways they're not. Both of them use a lot of design direct QB runs, meaning not zone read stuff, which is probably a little more what you would get out of, say, a Florida in that game. But the Alabama game, they're going to run Hurts directly, and A&M really didn't let him. They didn't let Hurts have a ton of success on those plays. They kind of made him be a scrambler and try to run to catch them out of position, because when he ran on a design carry, A&M was able to really control the line of scrimmage to a large extent. Now, I'm going to kind of step back against that narrative too, because we really lauded Texas A&M's run defense going into the Florida game. One of the concerns to me out of the past 2 weeks is A&M's run defense statistics have taken a really significant step back. I mean, they were in the elite category. They were something like 65% when we did the preview for the Alabama game. They're all the way down to 94% now. And it's a combination of two things. It's not just that Florida and Alabama actually had pretty good success running the football, because they did. And Florida was above their season average by a good mark. Alabama was pretty close to it. The other issue is that a lot of the other teams A&M's played, Louisiana Lafayette, Arkansas, and South Carolina, have all kind of gotten exposed as bad offenses, and that's taken the shine off it a little bit. So I do think there are a lot of good signs to how they did against Alabama, but as strange as it is to say they did a pretty good job against Alabama, I was expecting them to have an elite job against Alabama and then follow it up with an elite job against Florida. And it's looking more like they did a really good job, but they may not be completely dominant. And I am concerned by the fact that they actually let Florida run better than they did Alabama. It feels like they're backsliding a little bit. They're getting dinged up. Just minor bumps and bruises, if nothing else, across the defensive front that really impacts your depth. And for a team like A&M that plays through starters almost the entire game on the front seven, it doesn't just take a toll in one game when they play a lot of snaps, and that's what a lot of people see. It takes a really significant toll over the course of the season, because their starters are seeing a lot more snaps than most teams, and they've come. It's very good that they had a week off, because they played a lot of snaps the past 2 weeks playing against the run, and I think it kind of showed in the way the statistics played out.
So I think you make a good point about, and we talked a little bit about that in the Florida game. Malik Davis had a good day. Franks had the 79-yarder and a couple other runs as well. I wonder, though, Harris Williams coming off the LSU game where he was 23 carries, 146 yards, 6.3 yards per. He hasn't had a whole lot this year. Besides that, I know he had the BYU game where he had 114 yards, but he was 5 yards carry against BYU's. It's not that great. Struggled pretty heavily against Kentucky. So let's say that A&M's run defense has taken a step back. Can I counter with, is it a fair counter to say it may not matter, because I don't know that Mississippi State has the personnel to exploit that? Is there a Malik Davis on this team? Is there a Damian Harris on this team for Mississippi State that can take advantage of what A&M might be giving them?
That's hard to say, and they've run the ball pretty well. Harris Williams is a solid back, but none of these guys are necessarily next level elite players. I think Williams is a solid back. Hill is a solid back. Williams is probably not an NFL tailback, and Malik Davis probably is, and Alabama probably has 2 or 3 guys that are going to become maybe starters in the NFL. Fitzgerald is the key to Mississippi State, and it goes back to the thing that I was talking about earlier with the QBR statistics. Jalen Hurts is a pretty good running quarterback, and there's always a lot of stuff lauded on him as a runner, what he's able to do. Jalen Hurts is 21st nationally in ESPN's QBR's run estimated points added. Fitzgerald is second. It's a really significant gap, and as much as A&M was able to contain Franks and Hurts, Fitzgerald is a really a different level of runner. He's a lot more physical. He can absolutely bow you over. He's fast. It's sort of almost deceptively shifty. He is a really really tough guy to control because of his really just sheer power. And we've talked about this a lot. The toughest thing to deal with, I think, in a running quarterback sometimes isn't the fast running quarterback, it's the powerful one. It's the Cam Newton, Tim Tebow guys, because on those power run plays with a quarterback where you have the halfback pulling, the guy that has to come up and make the tackle a lot of times is a corner or a safety because you've got an extra blocker to running back to take out the outside linebacker. And the quarterback tends to get to a second level player that has to make the tackle. When you've got that kind of size advantage, it gets really tough because now you're asking somebody like a Marnie Watts to come in and make that tackle instead of a middle linebacker, and it's a tough ask, and teams really really struggle with that kind of matchup.
And we really like to talk about matchups and specifically where teams can find advantages or have disadvantages. So I want to talk a little bit about Kellen Mond because you were pretty high on him coming out of the Alabama game. You thought that we were going to see some progression this year to where he may play his way into being one of the top quarterbacks in the SEC, which isn't saying a lot this year because it's not a great crop of quarterbacks, but I think it is high praise for a freshman. Talk a little bit about how Mon matches up against this Mississippi State defense. Are there some things that they do that could give him trouble, or are there some things that he does that could really exploit Mississippi State?
Mond struggled last week, and I think it was because of the environment. We talked about that, kind of almost beat that to death, right? I think the hostile road environment was really tough on Mond. But for the rest of the year, he's been a good player, and he's operated at a high level, and he's been able to do what A&M has needed him to do. Now, he's played up and down quite a bit, and when he has played up and down, it tends to be in like a first half, second half kind of thing. It's typical of a freshman. Louisiana Lafayette was a big one. He struggled really badly the first half of that game, and then the second half he just tore him apart. The Arkansas game, he played at a pretty high level throughout, I felt like, and a lot of what I felt in the Alabama game was really coming out of that Arkansas game. Struggled a little bit with South Carolina. I mean, it's just been hot and cold and hot and cold. But I also don't know that Mississippi State has really faced someone that is that elusive. Mississippi State's biggest problem in recent years has been really athleticism throughout the defense, and probably a lot of Mississippi State fans think I'm crazy for saying that. They're really, really athletic at certain positions, and they've got some guys, Simmons or Leo Lewis, that are really good, and then they've got a lot of other guys in the defense that are just kind of guys. And at times, if you can get somebody on the edge, or if you can get time to exploit it, I think there are certain players for Mississippi State that get exposed a little bit. And I think even guys like Leo Lewis, a lot of the guys they have are almost throwback big physical guys. And probably a bad example because I think Leo Lewis is actually an excellent football player. But I think that's kind of the issue. And what Mon does with his ability to extend plays, yes, but also his ability to roll out, is it makes it a lot easier to move launch points and change angles, and that lets you get those space matchups that you want. A&M is a spread team. It is a vertical spread team, and they're going to test the athleticism that Mississippi State has. Mond may not be consistent or necessarily even that accurate, but he's got the arm to make almost any throw on the field. That's what impressed me so much for a few weeks. He doesn't necessarily always make them, and Florida was really able to harass him, and he was just horribly uncomfortable in that game. You could tell he was rattled. But if he's out there in space and you've got a guy in coverage way downfield, he can make that throw, and he's going to put you in a position where your defender or your corner or your nickelback is going to have to make a play in coverage 50 yards downfield. And that's, I think, where Mississippi State has struggled the most in recent
All
years.
right, so I think now is as good a time as any to just sort of dive into the numbers in detail on this. So what does the model say about this game? And let me know, just go ahead and get into your gut after you tell us about the model, and let us know if you're tracking with the model or what your score would be just based off your gut after that.
The model's not really all that hard to explain this week. Both teams are averaging right at 93 to 96% of opponent averages, rush and pass for both teams. The defenses are quite similar statistically. It's kind of amazing, and that's where I talked about A&M taking a big step back. A&M's defense was really highly rated in our model for a while, and I say highly rated. They were allowing a really low percent of opponent offensive averages. They've slipped back. A little bit of it, I think, was a return to mean by opposing offenses again. A little bit was a regression the past couple of weeks. Mississippi State's kind of the opposite. They started pretty poor, and they've improved. And now both teams are in the realm of being solid defenses. 90 to 95% is solid. That means you don't want to be 100% because there's enough garbage teams in the schedule that every team's numbers are a little bit inflated. You want to be hold them less than their average, but they're not holding them to a whole lot less than their average. So what really ends up happening when you're right at this level is both teams are kind of expected to have their average offensive game. And what does that look like for both teams? Well, A&M has generally been able to put up points. They've scored at least 19 points in every football game. Most games they've scored more than that. So it guesses they're going to get about 29 points. Mississippi State has varied a lot more with the quality of their opponents. And for that reason, the fact that they only scored 3 against Georgia and they only scored 10 against Auburn, their floor is a lot lower. And that's how it comes up with them having 16. So the model's projection is Texas A&M 29, Mississippi State 16. And it's a pretty average game for both teams. And I think very interestingly, it actually thinks Mississippi State will outgain Texas A&M 5.3 yards per play to 5.2. What it's basically saying is Texas A&M is a more explosive team and maybe a little better at generating turnovers or avoiding negative plays than Mississippi State. So A&M will be able to score about twice as effectively off the same yardage as Mississippi State.
And how do you feel about that in terms of just your gut pick?
I think, honestly, I think that's probably a little too high. I'm not really thrilled with what I've seen from Texas A&M, and I'm really curious to see how this pans out because honestly, they've really faded in the second half of seasons under Sumlin for years now. And I really want to see them break that trend. I really want to see them improve. I have a lot of respect for what they have done and all the time and energy has been spent in trying to build that program up. And I think it's kind of a shame that they keep fading late in the year. And on the other hand, Mississippi State has often kind of had the same problem. They get late in the season, start playing harder opponents in SEC play, and they fade. But right now, my guess is A&M for the past 2 games. I feel like they kind of ran out of gas a little bit. And it's hard to say how much of that they get back coming out of the bye, but I'm guessing not a ton. And so it's tough. My guess is this is probably more like a 21-16 A&M win over Mississippi State, but it's just a big asterisk to me because I feel like the potential's there for them to be a much better team than we've seen, for them to win this game 40-10. That's the team I expected to show up against Florida 2 weeks ago. But the reason I'm not making that pick is that I didn't see that team. That was absolutely not the team that came out against Florida. And I've seen that a little bit too much, frankly, under Sumlin. So until they prove me wrong, I did at least pick them correctly to beat Florida, but, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice. I'm not going to pick them to be that juggernaut. I still think they win this game, but I think it's lower scoring and more like a 21-16 affair.
I'm really having a hard time with this one. I'll be honest. This is the first time this year, and I picked Mississippi State to beat Georgia, but I didn't have a hard time with it. Like, I'm having a hard time with this because you have a team in A&M who hasn't been blown out this year. You can say the second half of the UCLA game they were blown out, but you're throwing in an untested quarterback in that kind of environment, that situation. That's a tough situation. So A&M hasn't been blown out this year. On the flip side, you've got Mississippi State, who is coming off a 45-7 win against Kentucky, who's not a terrible team. They blew out LSU earlier in the year, but sandwiched in between that are two just complete zeros they rolled out there in Georgia and Auburn. So you have the team that has the potential to get a blowout win versus a team that doesn't get blown out. So it's really hard for me because that's how you and I have a kind of a repeated pattern that we look at, to where how do you do against poor competition? Do you take care of business? And, how do you do obviously against the better teams? So I don't love what I saw with A&M against Florida. I don't love it because I don't think Florida is that good. If I felt like Mississippi State could run the ball in this game, I would be picking them by about 10 points. But because I don't think they have that Malik Davis in the backfield, and I do know they have a elite running quarterback, but because they don't have that Malik Davis, I'm going to go 24-21 Texas A&M, and it's almost all home crowd. I think we'll know a lot more about these two teams after this game, but right now that's kind of where I'm at. Everything in me is telling me to pick Mississippi State because of the blowout, the potential they have to blow a team out. But give me A&M 24, Mississippi State 21.
I understand that. The thing with Mississippi State to me is, with their blowouts, they blew out LSU, but they've blown out bad teams, and I don't think A&M is a bad team regardless, and I think they have a pretty good run defense, and unless they just fold in a way we haven't seen them do this season, I don't think it's going to be a blowout. And what we've also seen, I think, from Mississippi State is when they're actually in a game where they can't move the ball really well offensively, when they have to sustain drives, I just think they're too inconsistent to do it, and that's really why I fall in the same boat that you do, and I think this is a close win. But I think both of us feel like there is a lot of uncertainty here. We've seen Mississippi State has won often handily against really bad teams, and they've lost really badly against really good teams. This game is somewhere in the middle, I think, and neither one of us really knows how it should go. So even though we're late in the season now, I mean, theoretically week 9, depending on how you want to count it, I think this game is a much more open question than one would expect. For an SEC game all the way now going into the end of October.
Yeah, it's interesting because at this point, usually, we start running we hold off until week 4 or 5 to run our models because we want to have enough data, right? But usually by week 8, week 9, we know enough about these teams to not be this confused, but here we are. So, like I said, I think we'll know a whole lot more about both of these teams after they play one another.